Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Indiana Landmark Center. And I'd like to welcome our guests that are joining us on Zoom tonight. I've just got a few instructions for our Zoom attendees. We're using the webinar version, so your microphone will be muted and your picture will also be hidden. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A. We're going to have only be able to take a few questions tonight, but Dr. Glass has graciously offered to follow up with many of you by email if we're not able to answer your question. And also just one other thing for the Zoom viewers, Dr. Glass will be using a laser pointer, but unfortunately it will not be visible on Zoom, but we know that he has a sophisticated audience that knows its architectural terminology, so hopefully there won't be any problems. So with that, I'd like to welcome Marsh Davis, the president of Indiana Landmarks.
That was Suzanne Stannis, by the way. Those are our lecture series. Very good. Hi, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening, whether you're here in person or joining us virtually. We at Indiana Landmarks are proud to host this event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, historian and preservationist, Dr. James A. Glass. Now, in order to preserve as much time as possible for Dr. Glass's presentation, my introduction shall be very brief, which is no easy task given his long and distinguished resume. I would reckon that most in this audience are familiar with Jim. Many of you are regular attendees at his legendary lectures on world architecture history, through which he has attained a following that most rock stars would envy. Look at the crowd. For those of you who are not familiar with Jim, or for any needing a quick refresher, here are just a few highlights from his impressive career. He holds a Ph.D. in architectural history and historic preservation from Cornell University. He has served as staff historian for the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. More recently, and twice, he was Indiana's Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer when he ran the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology for the Department of Natural Resources. And for 13 years, he directed the Master of Science program in Historic Preservation at Ball State University's College of Architecture and Planning, where he founded and directed the Ball State University Center for Historic Preservation. He is an advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation and has served on the boards of the Propylaeum Foundation, and I am proud to add, of Indiana Landmarks. We are equally honored that Dr. Glass has been a member of Indiana Landmarks since 1976. Dues-paying member. Currently, he is the principal of the firm Historic Preservation and Heritage Consulting, LLC. His publications are numerous and substantive, including the definitive history of the origins of the modern federal preservation program. Presently, he is at work on a new book, Architecture in Indianapolis, 1820 to 1920, which is the subject of tonight's program. Tonight's attendees will receive email updates on the progress of this highly anticipated publication. If I could describe Jim in just a few words, I would say that he is the intellectual standard bearer for historic preservation in Indiana. Please give a warm welcome to my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. James A. Glass.
Thank you, Marsh, for that overly generous and wonderful introduction. Marsh has been a treasured colleague of mine for many, many years, and Indiana Landmarks is the supreme historic preservation organization in the whole country. I want to thank Indiana Landmarks for sponsoring the event tonight. And it was a pleasure to be with so many friends and colleagues here, both here in person and online. I want to thank Suzanne Stannis and Kyle Costello and others for making the arrangements tonight. And I want to thank 10 people who have been very patiently reading manuscript chapters of my book as it comes together. Thank you all for your encouragement and advice. Our topic tonight is architecture in Indianapolis, 1880 to 1920, and a little bit of orientation. First, to sort of indicate the growth that Indianapolis experienced in this 40-year period. Here are some statistics. Population in 1880, 94,500. In 1920, the population was over 314,000. The number of manufacturers in 1894 was over 1,000. The number of manufacturers in 1907 was reported at 2,350. The number of retail stores in 1894, 1,100. The number of retail stores in 1920, 2,300. And there were over 53,000 homes in 1920. Now, what are we going to be talking about tonight? We're going to be talking about building types, that is, railroad stations, tall office buildings, retail buildings, hotels, theaters, industrial buildings, public buildings and monuments, schools, buildings of worships, residences, and apartments. We're also going to be talking about architectural styles, that is, Romanesque, Italian Renaissance, Roman and Greek classical, Gothic, workers' cottages, shotgun houses, American four-square houses, arts and crafts and craftsman houses, bungalows, Georgian style houses, and English Tudor style. Now, a little bit of orientation. Many of the buildings we're going to be talking about tonight are located or were located in the mile square area. You can see the red crosses indicating a concentration there. And one final note, when you see a cross beside the list of a building, the name of a building, that means it has been demolished. And I'm sorry to say there are going to be a number of those crosses tonight. Well, there was a boom time after the Civil War, and Indianapolis during that boom time became known as the Railway City. Why was this? Well, by the 1890s, there were 15 steam railroad lines coming in and out of Indianapolis, and Indianapolis had an enviable network, which was lending support to commerce in and out of the city. Also, the growth of passenger traffic, so much increase in passenger traffic that by the 1880s, the New York Central Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which were the owners of the Indianapolis Union Railway Station, decided they needed a much larger station. They retained this man, Thomas Rodd, an architect and engineer of Pittsburgh. He, together with other colleagues, designed the building we see here. A couple of things noticeable immediately. One is this tall, lofty clock tower on the corner, and then the use of the Romanesque style for much of the building, including arches over the windows and a huge arch composed of voussoirs, wedge-shaped stones over this large wheel window, all built out of brick and granite. Where was this coming from? Well, quite likely, it was coming from the work of this man, Henry Hobson Richardson, the top Boston architect. And he had taken a fancy to Romanesque architecture that he found in southern France and northern Spain. He brought back his love of the Romanesque to this country and incorporated it into many of his buildings, and his influence spread far and wide, such as in this building, the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, where we can see some similarities to some details in Indianapolis, namely a tall campanile or bell tower, similar to the clock tower we saw in Indianapolis, and then these round-headed windows, Romanesque windows in several different levels, and then Romanesque archways for the three entryways. We go back to Indianapolis, you can see the influence of the Romanesque inside the waiting station of the Indianapolis Union Railway Station, and the Romanesque features include this large plaster barrel vault with stained glass skylight, and then a Romanesque arcade along the sides. Now, a city like Indianapolis was growing at the rate it was, and many other cities in the country were building tall office buildings or skyscrapers. Let's take a look at some of the examples in Indianapolis. Traditionally, the first skyscraper in Indianapolis was the Majestic Building on South Pennsylvania Street, designed by Oscar Bolin of D.A. Bolin and Son. The inspiration for skyscrapers in their modern form came out of Chicago, where architects there were building the steel skeletons to support the structural load of these buildings, and then hanging masonry veneer walls, exterior walls on those skeletons. Bolin used this formula and designed the Majestic Building, a 10-story building, and then the tallest building in the city, limestone exterior, and he incorporated Romanesque arches and even Byzantine-style arches into the facade, and then this projecting Italian Renaissance cornice at the very top. And if we look at one of the entry archways leading into the building, we can see the influence of Richardson in this Romanesque arch with this delightful, delicate stone sculptures around the arch. And then there's Oscar Bolin there to the left. Now, one tall building led to another, and many aspired to the title of the tallest building in the city. The next tall office building to note was the Stevenson Building on East Washington Street, designed by one of the top Chicago architects, Henry Ives Cobb, we see here. And here's Cobb's building. He used a steel skeleton with a masonry envelope on the outside. And he used, coming out of Chicago, a three-part formula for the composition of this building. And you want to use the analogy of a classical column. You had a base section, a shaft section, and a capital section. He used classical pilasters in terracotta for the base section and for the capital section. And at the very top was a projecting cornice styled on from the Italian Renaissance. Now, I said earlier that the steam railroad was going very strong, but it soon encountered mighty competition from the electric interurban trains. These were trains, electric trains between cities. They were bringing many passengers into the city. By 1913, there were 6.4 million passengers coming in and out of downtown Indianapolis. Faced with this increase, the interurban interests decided to build an office building and a train shed for their enterprise. And they hired one of the top architectural firms in the country, Daniel H. Burnham and Company of Chicago. And Burnham and his staff designed a 9-story office building with a steel skeleton and a masonry brick envelope. And the very top of the 9th floor was this arcade of Romanesque arches and an immense Romanesque arch for the entryway leading into the building. And if we look at this structure from the west, we see there was a 2-story transitional building which contained the waiting room for the traction terminal, this immense train shed sheltering 9 rails, which in turn supported these electric interurban cars. And there is Daniel Burnham himself to the left. Now, this 3-port formula coming out of Chicago for skyscrapers took hold in Indianapolis, as we can see in the Board of Trade building, which stood at Ohio and Meridian Street. The 3-part formula, we had limestone with colossal Corinthian pilasters, and then a shaft section of red brick with terracotta surrounds around the windows, and then more terracotta enriching the capital section, and then projecting out is this copper Italian Renaissance cornice. Brubaker was the architect and Elbridge was the engineer. Now, Indianapolis was very fortunate to have diagonal avenues in its 1821 Ralston plan. This enabled designers to design and build flat iron or triangular shaped office buildings. This is one of the best, the Knights of Pythias office building in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and built by one of the top fraternal orders, the Knights of Pythias, who hired J.F. Alexander and Son of Lafayette to design their building. The architects designed this flat iron building with a limestone envelope on the exterior and this steeply projecting Italian Renaissance cornice. Now, without any doubt, the tallest office building in the state by 1912 was the Merchants Bank building standing at Washington and Meridian Street. This was built by the Merchants National Bank. It aspired to have a symbol of its prominence. And they hired, for prestige reasons, Daniel H. Burnham and Company again to design their building. Burnham and his staff used a 3-part formula with these limestone pilasters on the base section, and then a red vitrified brick shaft with a more limestone for the capital section, and then a projecting Italian Renaissance cornice. And if we go inside, we're pleased to see that the banking room of the Merchants National Bank has been preserved, a 2-story room with Roman Doric columns and these Roman coffers in the ceiling. One of the chief competitors for the Merchants National Bank was the Indiana National Bank. And some years earlier, they had gone a very different direction. They had built a banking palace for their headquarters. They'd hired Oscar Boland to design it for them. And he had derived the exterior design of this building from the banking palace designs of the 16th century Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. And from Palladio's palaces, we find these Corinthian pilasters going down the side of the building, engaged columns forming a temple front in the middle of the side, and then a more elaborate temple front for the facade. And then rustication along the ground floor. What is rustication? Limestone blocks with beveled edges. We go into the banking room, this very large, majestic banking room with a round stained glass skylight and marble on the walls and mosaics on the floors, alas, demolished in 1970. Now, the other major building type in a thriving city like Indianapolis in the 1890s and early 20th century were retail stores. The traditional retail store form, which you see in 2 buildings on East Washington Street, was you had a single retailer selling one product in his building and going up vertically for additional selling space and storage. So this is an example of traditional retailing. But there was a revolution coming in retailing, namely the department store. And a department store entailed a large building in which you had all kinds of products being sold in departments for one-stop shopping. The first dry goods store to build a department store was L.S. Ayres and Company, and they built their department store at Washington and Meridian Street and hired the very talented architect Bernard Vonnegut of Vonnegut Bone to design it. Vonnegut used sparing in the ornamentation in this brick masonry envelope, although he did use capital A's on shields for the cornice and lion's head down near the lowest part of the building. If we go inside, we can see immediate affinity between this building, this department store, and the grand department store of Chicago, Marshall Field and Company, namely a two-story room with these lofty columns with Corinthian capitals. Now, one of the primary competitors for L.S. Ayres and Company was the William H. Block Company, founded by an Austrian immigrant. And William H. Block, by 1910, was ready to build his own department store building. He hired the same architects to design it, and they designed this large rectangular building clad completely in white, creamy terracotta. Terracotta was a ceramic material which, when fired in the kiln in molds with decorative elements, could form almost any kind of decorative shape. This building was advantageously located across the street from Electric Interurban. Now, there was an experiment in the 1890s, a different type of retailing, namely the retail shopping arcade seen in the Pembroke Arcade on Virginia Avenue. The proprietors of this, Dixon and Talbot, had gotten the idea perhaps from the Cleveland Arcade. The idea was you have shops located in enclosed arcades or malls, and they hired Bernard Vonnegut to design this. Looking at the Virginia Avenue facade, this immense recessed arch with intricate terracotta and a wrought iron decorative detail, and then this lunette, a stained glass lunette, designed by the noted Chicago stained glass artist Louis Mallet. When we go inside, you can see there were shops on the ground level and offices on the second level. You had this arch skylight letting lots of natural light into the building, and there's Bernard Vonnegut to the left. Now, in any kind of a thriving city with lots of commerce, you're going to have hotels, and there were several grand hotels built during our period. Let's take a look at a couple of these. The first really grand hotel was a combination, English's Opera House and Hotel, combination hotel and opera house or theater. William H. English got the idea in 1880 to build this. He hired a New York architectural firm, McAlpatrick, to design the original section, which was this section here on the circle, with the opera house behind. In 1897, English's son hired Oscar Bolin to complete the hotel, as it were. And so Oscar Bolin completed the facade of this hotel to cover the entire northwest quadrant of Monument Circle with this curvilinear limestone facade with these paired Italianate style brackets, and these are Bain curving turrets. Behind the facade was the Opera House with this immense proscenium with these concentric arches in plaster with a Baroque detail also in plaster. Now, I think, in my opinion, the grandest hotel ever built in this city was the Claypool Hotel at Washington and Illinois Street, designed by this man, Frank Andrews of Dayton, Ohio. And Andrews designed an immense structure, rectangular structure, modeled in a way on European royal palaces of the 18th century. He used the Italian Renaissance theme for the exterior, such as these Palladian devices, they're called, in the second story. There is rustication going up the corners from the Italian Renaissance, and these paired Corinthian pilasters, also from the Renaissance. We go inside for the lobby. We see this lofty space with 16 majestic columns with scagliola imitation marble exteriors on the shafts, and then Roman coffering overhead. Now, Andrews was very skilled in using a variety of historical periods for different rooms in the Claypool Hotel, such as the Louis XIV parlor, in which the walls and ceilings are encrusted with French Rococo detail. Now, if you were a budget-minded commercial traveler, perhaps you'd stay in the Hotel Washington on East Washington Street, built in 1912, designed by R.P. Daggett and Company. It's a 15-story building. The top floor had an assembly room seating several hundred people. They had a Rathskeller restaurant at the lower level. And the proprietor very proudly said, "This is a first-class hotel at affordable prices." Now, competing more directly with Claypool was the Hotel Severn on Georgia Street, designed by Vonnegut Bone, only half block from the Union Station. And Vonnegut Bone used the Italian Renaissance as their theme for this Renaissance-style arcade. These rusticated limestone blocks, and then going up the corners are Renaissance-style coins, and the very top, a projecting copper cornice from the Italian Renaissance, and above that, a roof garden. Now, theaters are the part of any kind of thriving city, and we already looked at the English's Opera House. In 1909 to 1910, its chief competition for legitimate theater was the Mural Theater. This was built as part of a package by the Mural Shriners, a fraternal branch of Masonry. And the Shriners wanted to build a combination temple for their operations, for their meetings, and a theater to which they leased to the Schubert brothers in New York, one of the top theatrical operators in the country. They hired Oscar Boland to design this. He went to New York to confer with the Schuberts and get ideas from their new theater for the theater design. The Shriners wanted an Islamic style exterior for their temple. And so Boland and his staff studied Islamic precedents, and this is the result. And if you look at it, you'll find it's very similar to a madrasa or school and mosque in 15th century Cairo, Egypt. And chiefly, we see this in the minaret at the corner, in this pumpkin dome, and then these alternating stripes of brown brick and yellow brick. We take a closer look at the facade and see the skillful use of terracotta with geometric decorative forms. This is to abide with the prohibition in Islam against figural decoration. If we go inside the theater, we see 2,000 seats, 2,000 seat theater, and these convex descending boxes on either side. And then above are murals showing this great pyramid and Sphinx in Egypt on one side, and travelers traveling on camels in the desert on the other. Now, there was a revolution coming in theaters in Indianapolis across the country. This had to do with movies. And after 1910, there were movie theaters being built. The first movie palace in Indianapolis was the Circle Theater, a monument circle, built between 1916 and 17 and designed by Rubush and Hunter, the architects. The architects were told by their clients they wanted a dignified facade in the classical style on the monument circle. So they drew from Greek classicism for this white terracotta facade, and particular I want to note these dancing figures, which resemble those from the Parthenon's frieze, and then a Greek classical theme seen above the marquee. We go into the theater, a 3,000 seat auditorium in which you have this delightful low relief plaster decorative detail, spider-like in its character, modeled on the work of the noted 18th century British architect, Robert Adam. Now, the lifeblood of any great city is its factories. We saw the statistics and the increase in number of factories. Let's take a look at some of these. One of the early factories in Indianapolis in the early 1880s was that of Eli Lilly and Company down on McCarty Street. They hired R.P. Daggett and Company to design this. The architect's design of H-shaped plant for manufacturing pharmaceutical products. And then there was a building in between containing the laboratory and offices, which had Romanesque details. Now, one of the largest ethnic groups in Indianapolis were German Americans. And hence there were many breweries and much beer drinking, somewhat like today. And one of the more imposing breweries was the Home Brewing Company at Adalia and Cruise or Shelby Street, which you see here. The brew house where the beer was produced is this section. Taller section next to it had the chill rooms for the beer and storage facilities. And then also the same was true of this tall tower. The architectural forms are Romanesque arcades on several different levels. Now, there was a great upheaval coming in American life in the early 20th century, and this had to do with the advent of the automobiles. And Indianapolis was one of the chief centers of the manufacture of automobiles in the early 20th century, and many automobile factories were built, such as the Cole Motor Car Company factory out on East Washington Street, built between 1911 and 1919, designed by Herbert L. Bass and Company. You see Herbert Bass here. And here is the principal building with a white ceramic tile facade and limestone tablets, which once contained the emblem of the coal motor car factory. This whole structure reinforced concrete. I think everyone's familiar with the Stutz Motor Car Company factory on Capitol Avenue between 10th Street and 11th Street, built between 1914 and 1920, and designed by D.A. Bolin and Son architects. They designed 4 identical pavilions, built a reinforced concrete structure with buff brick veneer on the outside. Now, I said earlier that the Union Station was experiencing competition for the electric interurbans, but they continued to expand. By 1910, 200 trains a day were coming in and out of Union Station. And the chief factor in Union Station was the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they decided we need to build a much larger structure to accommodate this increase in passenger traffic and also to take care of some safety issues. They hired this man, William Price, of the Philadelphia architectural firm Price and McClanahan, and Price designed an elevated train structure and a concourse structure that covered 7 acres and cost $2 million. And here is the north facade of that. He built it out of reinforced concrete and steel structure with a brick veneer. He also looked ahead to modernism and modern architecture with these abstracted Gothic buttresses going down the facade, and then using colored terracotta as accents, and also mixed into it Roman thermal windows. And we go inside, we see how he accommodated a challenge right in front of him. Before this, the passengers had to walk across the tracks to get to their train, not a very safe proposition. And so he designed this concourse, a corridor, in which passengers would go down to one of 6 stairways and go safely up to their train. He used terracotta for adornment, and in particular, he used terracotta for these delightful lotus bud flowers with these bright colors. Now, in any great city, such as Indianapolis is becoming, there were public buildings and monuments. The most popular public building in the state was the Indiana State House, built between 1878 and 1888, designed by Edwin May, who won a national architectural competition but died only a year later. And so his chief draftsman, Andrew Adolph Scher, took over. This building, we look at it, has a lot of similarities in its plan and layout to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, namely this large dome and drum. Both buildings have these at the center of the structure. Both have wings that come out from the center, north and south in this case, and additional pavilions. And then a large pavilion that comes out from the center with a portico. Now, from Roman imperial architecture comes the details of these Corinthian columns in the portico, coming from Roman imperial temples. There's an echo of these temple fronts, these outlining pavilions. And then these colossal Corinthian pilasters come out of the work of Michelangelo in the Italian Renaissance in Rome. Now, we go inside, we see these delightful atria, which draw also from the Italian Renaissance and Roman architecture. In particular, I want to draw your attention to these columns, which observe correct hierarchical order with the Doric columns, the lowest level, Ionic columns, and then Corinthian columns at the very top. The marble floor in multiple colors derives from Roman imperial temples. Now, the chief public room, which has been preserved, is the Indiana Supreme Court courtroom with these majestic Corinthian pilasters and much other wonderful Italian Renaissance detail, and this has been restored by the court. Now, the chief monument in the city, and one which became the symbol of the city, was built by the state of Indiana to commemorate the valor of the Indiana soldiers and sailors in the Civil War. That is the Indiana Soldiers and Sailors Monument in the center of Monument Circle. It was designed by this man, who was a 29-year-old architect from Berlin, Germany, who won an international architectural competition to design this, and he used a neo-Baroque design where the shaft is modeled on Egyptian obelisk. The Statue of Victory at the very top looks south over the scene of victory in the Civil War. And then there are multiple sculptural groups which tell the story of the battles and the struggles of Indiana soldiers and sailors, such as the War Group with sculptures by the Austrian sculptor Rudolf Schwarz. Now, there were other public buildings being built in Indianapolis. By virtue of a bequest, Tomlinson Hall was built at Market and Delaware Street in the mid-1880s. And Diedrich and Oscar Bolin, father and son, became the architects. This building had a city market on the ground floor and a 3,500-seat auditorium in the upper stories. The Bolins drew from the Italian Renaissance for this temple front with these Ionic pilasters, also these round-headed arches from the Italian Renaissance, and then also from the Renaissance of these stone quoins, and then from Roman imperial architecture, these thermal windows. In the same block, almost at the same time, the city decided to build a market house proper, and the Bolins also designed this. These two towers, matching towers, bespeak the public purpose of the building, and then you have multiple tall round-headed windows admitting an abundance of natural light into the interior. Now, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful public buildings ever built in Indianapolis was the U.S. Courthouse and Post Office building on Ohio Street, built between 1903 and 5, and designed by the Philadelphia architects John Hall Rankin and Thomas Kellogg. They drew their design with these Ionic columns, this colonnade and the facade and the sides, from the Ionic colonnade in the original Treasury building in Washington, D.C., designed some 80 years earlier by Robert Mills. Inside, you see the architects were very skilled in drawing from different historical periods of architecture for the decorative program, the lavish decorative program. Here's a stair hall inside in which you have these groin vaults encrusted with Byzantine mosaics and this sweeping marble, self-supporting marble stairway. And there are the two architects standing astride one of the immense Ionic capitals. Now, the city of Indianapolis was justly proud of its own civic monument. That's a city hall at Alabama and Ohio Street. This was the brainchild of Mayor Charles Bookwalter. Rubish and Hunter were hired as the architects. They designed this very large rectangular building drawn from Roman classical architecture. And your eye is drawn immediately to these Roman Doric columns standing in antis, that is recessed in the facade, with additional Roman classical details in the entablature and these three entryways, leading into the vestibule, which we see on the left, and where we can begin to appreciate the lavish decorative program in this building, with marble in the walls and these Tuscan columns which support groin vaults covered with mosaics. And as you proceed from the vestibule into the center of the building, you see this majestic four-story rotunda with an art glass skylight, and then much elaborate stucco decorative details derived from the Italian Renaissance and Rome. Now, another type of public building is, of course, our library branches. Indianapolis was fortunate in these years to have 5 Carnegie Library branches being built, and one of these was the Spades Park Library branch on Nolan Avenue, designed by Wilson Parker. And what Parker did is he reached back to the Italianate style of about 40 years earlier and you derive these details, these round-headed windows in the second story, these oversized Italianate brackets supporting the hip roof, and this delightful terracotta surround composed in part of Tuscan columns. Now, second only to the U.S. Courthouse and Post Office, I think one of the most beautiful buildings in Indianapolis from our period or any others was the Indianapolis Public Library on St. Clair Street, built between 1915 and 17 and designed by the great classical architect Paul Philippe Cray of Philadelphia. Now, what Cray did was he reached back, drew from the architecture of classical Greece, and particularly that of the Parthenon, for these elegantly proportioned Greek Doric columns standing in antis, recessed in the facade, and for these carefully proportioned entablature also drawn from Greek architecture. Now we go inside, there's a photo of Cray to the left. He was very much imbued with the Beaux-Arts or fine arts method of design. He had studied in the L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. What is the Beaux-Arts style of design? It relies particularly on axes and cross axes. So the patron can see at one glance where the major functions of the building are and how to get to them. Now, this is the delivery room, one of the chief rooms in the building. And you see here also one of the other principal elements of the Beaux-Arts method was absolute adherence to symmetry. So on the south side, you have these rectangular openings matched exactly on the north side and also matched going east and west. And if you look up in the delivery room, you are delighted to see these scenes from ancient Roman Pompeii painted by the noted artist Gustav Ketter. Schools are a type of public building, and because of the explosive growth in school-age population there were several campaigns by the Indianapolis Public Schools to build schools. One of the first ones in our period was the William D. McCoy School, number 24, on West North Street. This school is a symbol of segregation. This was the era of segregation, and there was pervasive discrimination by the white majority against the African-American minority. This was expressed in schools because the school board built separate buildings for African-American children. So this was one of the African-American children schools for African-American children. The architect relied on the Italianate style for these brackets which support the cornice and this hip roof. About 10 years later, there was another building campaign, and the school board built this school. This was for white children, School 23 at 22nd and Illinois Street. And by this time, it was the time of Romanesque architecture. So it has a Romanesque arch, this rock face stone, and then for decorative elements, you have these string courses, also rock face in character. In the mid-1890s, the school board built one of the first manual training high schools in the Midwest, down on South Meridian Street, and hired one of the top architecture firms from Philadelphia, Wilson Brothers and Company, to design it. Now, because of the limited budget for a decorative program, the architects relied on massing of this U-shaped plan with these pavilions coming out for monumentality, as they did with these bell towers with pyramidal roofs. Now, there was another building campaign by the school board after the turn of the century, and this was one of the larger schools built, the George W. Julian School 57 out in East Washington Street in the newly annexed suburb of Irvington, designed by Herbert Foltz, you see here. What Foltz did, by the way, this school has been rehabilitated recently, is still used as a school. Foltz drew from Georgian architecture these limestone flat arches. From the Italian Renaissance are these rusticated brick courses, which also ornament these two arch entryways. Now, there are several more schools for African-American children built after the turn of the century by the school board. One of the largest was the Robert Gould Shaw School, number 40, at Senate Avenue and Walnut Street, close to the center of the African-American community, and designed by white architect Thomas Winterode. Winterode drew from the Italian Renaissance for some of the detailing of this building, namely these Tuscan columns standing on brick plinths from the Italian Renaissance, and then also from the Renaissance are these brick coins. He reached back to the Italianate style for these projecting cornices and the hip roof. There were two college buildings built in the early 20th century, which we should note. One is the Indiana Central University original building. Now, this came about because of an original interesting arrangement. There was a real estate agent named William L. Elder. He went to the United Brethren Church in Indiana and said, "I will build you a college building in which you can found a college if you will sell X number of lots in my new real estate addition, University Heights." Well, the college accepted his proposition. They sold the requisite number of lots. And so Elder went to H. Elwood, an architect, and said, "Go ahead and design the building. This is Elwood's design." All the college functions were in this one structure, and it had this imposing Ionic portico. Now, in these years, Butler College was located in Irvington. In 1901, they received a big donation that enabled them to build a college library, the Bonner Thompson Library, and they hired Jesse Johnson as the architect. Now, Johnson reached back about 15 years to the design of the facade of the Boston Public Library for these large round arch windows, which are linked by what are called impost blocks. But our eye is really drawn to this central pavilion that projects forward with these carefully proportioned Ionic columns standing in antis, recessed. Now, when a city triples its population over a 40-year period, you're going to have a number of new social, cultural, and athletic organizations, many of which are going to build buildings. Let's look at some of these. The Propylaeum was an organization founded by May Wright Sewell, one of the chief leaders of women's suffrage, women's rights, and women's leadership in the community, and also for cultural affairs. She and some of her colleagues founded the Propylaeum and built their own building to house their activities, and hired Adolph Scher and Scott Moore as the architects. We see the result, a rock-faced limestone facade with round arches. Contrasting idea are these pointed Gothic gables. In the upper story was an assembly room which could seat 600 people. Now, this was one of the more interesting discoveries I've made, this building. In the era of segregation, African-American men and women were not allowed to join white fraternal orders, so they formed their own fraternal orders, and one of these was the Grand United Order of Oddfellows. They, in 1890-91, built their own building, 500 block of Indiana Avenue, and hired M.H. Russell as their architect. Now, as is quite possible, if M.H. Russell were African-American, he was one of the very first African-American architects to practice in Indianapolis. And this is his drawing for this building. If we look at it, he used round-headed windows from the Italianate style for the second floor. And then on the third floor, these segmental arches bind together these paired windows with decorative pilasters in between. The next story is sort of a blind story with pilasters, decorative pilasters. And then finally, you have segmental arches and a triangular pediment, a segmental pediment and a triangular pediment, a very interesting design. Now, as I said before, one of the primary ethnic groups in Indianapolis were German Americans. One of the largest groups was the Socialer Turnverein, or Turners, abiding by sound body and sound mind. In the early 1890s, they decided to build a large building for their enterprise. They hired one of their own, Bernhard Vonnegut, to design. Das Deutsche Haus, or German House, was what they called it. This is the East Wing. Now, Vonnegut had been over to Germany and observed 16th century Rathhauses, or civic halls. And from these halls, he gleaned some of the ideas for design, such as this tall gable from the Rathaus designs. For the second story, he used Romanesque round-headed windows. And then he had this interesting cylindrical tower with a conical roof. And in 1897, they were able to complete the building, build the West Wing, had this immense tip roof with these diminutive dormer windows, and then another gable, like those from the Rathhauses, and then Renaissance-style pilasters, and then a Romanesque arch, and then right to the left was placed an 8-sided turret. Now, if you've ever been over to Germany and Rothenburg and seen the Rathaus there, you might say there might be some elements here similar to the Das Deutsche Haus, namely this sweeping roof with diminutive dormer windows, this many-sided turret, and then here is the gable I was talking about, which we saw similar in Das Deutsche Haus. Now, another German organization that aspired to build their own building was the Manacore. This is made up of German singers that had concerts, found in the 1850s. In 1960, they were ready to build their own building. They hired Adolf Scherer, who had been born in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, and he designed this building at Illinois and Michigan Street with Renaissance details. And the main part of the building is this wing on the north side that contained the music hall, but also there was this 8-sided turret, and then these wings that project out with a roof garden in between. If we go inside to see the music hall, we see Italian Renaissance pilasters and arches. Now, this was the era of men's clubs and women's clubs, particularly men's clubs were being organized across the United States in urban centers in cities. In Indianapolis, men's club often would be founded in a house. If they outgrew the house, then they might aspire to build their own building. Such was the case with the Columbia Club that had been founded in 1889 as part of the presidential campaign of Benjamin Harrison. After only 11 years, they'd outgrown their house on the Circle, and so they decided to build a clubhouse. They hired Frank Andrews, who was in town, to design the Claypool Hotel, and he designed what can only be called a sumptuous facade, which you see here. And it was designed by Andrews, drawing on the designs of the Back Bay mansions from Boston from the 1890s, designed by such architects as McKinley White. The 4 stories here are modeled on these mansions, complete with bowed fronts, which appeared in the Back Bay. Here is a Renaissance-style arcade, and then what's called a Palladian device in the 5th story with intricate plaster detailing. But then walk inside to the 5th story and feast your eyes on this ballroom, which was inside this building, complete with Corinthian paired columns supporting groin vaults, rising to this incrustation of Baroque plaster detail. Now, the largest fraternal order in Indiana was the Grand Lodge of Indiana Masons. In 1907, they decided to build their Masonic temple at Illinois and Michigan Street. Rubish and Hunter were hired as the architects. And I think you can see some similarities in the design of this building, the City Hall. In this case, though, you have Ionic columns standing in attis or recessed into the facade, and rusticated 1st and 2nd stories. Now, the architects used several different architectural themes for the interiors, but I think the most exotic was the Red Cross Room with these Egyptian details, complete with columns with lotus bud capitals, hieroglyphics, and sphinxes. Now, another African-American order was the AfricanAmerican Pepians. In 1910, they built a building at Senate Avenue, Walnut Street. The lodge rooms were on the second and third floor. There was a bank and the stores on the first story. The architect designed this with orangish bricks for accents, brown bricks for accents, and then these corbelled out string courses for decorative detail. Now, in American cities in the late 19th and early 20th century, one of the primary organizations providing a wholesome atmosphere for young white men to enjoy physical exercise, education, and attend lectures and better themselves were YMCAs. And the main YMCA outgrew their original building, and in 1908 decided to build a much larger building. They hired Folsom Parker as their architects, and they used a steel skeleton with buff brick and then terracotta pilasters for the facade. Now, a year or so later, some of the same business leaders who had raised money for the YMCA helped the women, the YWCA, raise money for their building, which we see here on 300 block of North Pennsylvania Street. D.A. Oscar Bolin was hired as the architect. Here is his design with orange brick veneer, these carefully studied ionic gauge columns standing in attis and recessed to the facade, and these delightful anti-fixi on top of the cornice. Now, there was an African-American YMCA founded in 1902. In the first decade of the 20th century, through careful organization, skillful organization, they grew to be one of the largest African-American YMCAs in the country. About 1910 or 11, they became aware of a philanthropic offer by the Chicago philanthropist Julius Rosenwald. He said, "I will pledge $25,000 to any city in the United States that raises an additional $75,000 to build an African-American YMCA." So the African-American board went to the main YMCA board and basically proposed a joint venture to raise the money. So they did a joint venture, raised the money, and the building was built. Herbert Foltz, who'd been the lead architect for the main YMCA, became the architect for the Senate Avenue YMCA at Senate Avenue, Michigan Street. There was a limited decorative budget, and so the architect used upraised brick to form this diaper pattern in the parapet and this rustication between the windows, and then these decorative piers astride the entryway. The architect was able to put in many different functions into this four-story building for social, cultural, and athletic activities, including the gymnasium and the running track, which we see here. There was one museum built in the early 20th century. This was an art museum, the John Herron Art Institute at 16th and Pennsylvania Street. A bequest had made it possible. Vonnegut Bone were hired as the architects. Because of a limited budget, there was an austere decorative program, except below the cornice was a frieze of busts of outstanding Renaissance artists sculpted by Rudolf Schwartz. Now, in a city which is tripling in population, you're going to need new hospitals. And Indianapolis built 5 hospitals after the turn of the century. And let's look at a couple of these. The original building of the Methodist Episcopal Hospital at 16th and Capitol, we see here, built in 1904 and 5 and designed by Bernard Vonnegut, who used color effectively, I think, for this building. It has a limestone surround with these delightful angels rising up, almost providing healing for the patients within. The Catholic hospital was St. Vincent's Hospital, operated by the Sisters of Charity. They had previously operated an infirmary downtown, but they outgrew that. So in 1910, they decided to build a much larger hospital and acquired a site on Fall Creek on the north side of the city and hired Oscar Bolin, who designed this large U-shaped planned hospital with these interesting bowed fronts on the ends of the pavilion, somewhat like the back bay we were talking about earlier, and then the central pavilion with the triangular pediment overhead. The city of Indianapolis operated a city hospital for indigent patients, and they finally decided in 1912 to build a new campus for this hospital. They held an architectural competition, which was won by Adolph Scherer and Son, and this is their competition entry showing 2 buildings with Roman-style porticos, and these were actually built in the early 1920s. We're ready now to talk about buildings of worship in our period. One of the early churches built was the first evangelical association built by a German-speaking Protestant organization, congregation. They hired Dietrich Bohlen to design their church. We see his design here. He used round-headed Romanesque arches for much of the detail. But I want to draw your attention particularly to the permanent polychromy he used. This is where clay of different colors is fired in the kiln to form bricks of different colors, which can then be used to form decorative patterns. And this is one of the few buildings in Indianapolis following permanent polychromy, and there's Dietrich Bohlen to the left. Now, one of the most classic Gothic designs, I think, in the city's history was the Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Union Street on the south side, built for the south side Catholic population, and designed by a Franciscan brother, Brother Adrian Weaver. And we see Brother Weaver with his architectural drawings here. He modeled this church on Gothic cathedrals from France and Germany. I can see this in these absolutely symmetrical twin spires with a brick corbel table, a decorated Gothic east window, and these delicately detailed Gothic trio of Gothic entryways. Now, despite that particular use of Gothic, Romanesque reigned rather supreme for churches in the 1880s and 90s. None more so than in the building we're in tonight, the Central Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church at 12th and Central, which was designed by Williams in honor of Dayton. Now, they owed quite a debt to H. Richardson and his Romanesque architecture, as we can see in the trio of entryways here with these immense wedge-shaped voussoir blocks forming Romanesque arches. Also from Richardson's architecture, these slit windows in the main body and on the campanile or bell tower. The idea of a bell tower at the corner really comes from H. Richardson's design for the tower in the Albany, New York City Hall. And if we go inside where we are now, in this space, we can see two Renaissance or Romanesque arches at the back, which lead from the sanctuary back to the ancillary spaces. Then there's this immense plaster dome overhead us with ribs and a lantern, and at the base of which are these groups of Romanesque style windows, which really form a type of clerestory around the rim. Now, the only Byzantine design I really have found in our period was that of the Indianapolis Hebrew Temple, 970 North Delaware Street from 1898, designed by Vonnegut Bone. What's Byzantine? Well, it's a centralized plan with a Byzantine style central dome, and then these four diminutive domes at the four corners. And then from Romanesque architecture are these two Romanesque arches fit into each other with these rounded tracery panels. Now, one of my favorite Romanesque designs was the First Baptist Church of Vermont and Meridian Street, designed by two architectural firms, one from Cincinnati, one from New York. Gary carefully studied Richardson's Romanesque architecture, particularly for these two entries with these stepped arches. Here is the apse in which the worship platform was located inside, with a smaller Romanesque arcade, a conical tower, a roof on the tower. And then for a contrasting idea, you have this lantern with these Gothic style gables. Now, unequivocally Gothic was the First Presbyterian Church at 16th and Delaware Street, designed by Crapsey and Lamb in Cincinnati. We've got pointed arches for the big west window, also pointed arches for these three entryways, and then from Gothic cathedrals, these Gothic pinnacles. Now at 16th and Central, the Episcopal Diocese decided to build the All Saints Episcopal Cathedral. They hired an English-born architect, Alfred Grindle, to design this really modern church building, but he did use early English Gothic lancet windows for the windows of the west facade and for the windows along the nave. Now, I think one of the most delightfully decorated and detailed Gothic buildings was the St. Mary's Catholic Church at Vermont and New Jersey Street, built in 1912 and designed by Herman Gall of Chicago, who had been born in Cologne, Germany. And in fact, from Cologne Cathedral, we can see its influence in this incrustation of pinnacles on the twin spires and these delicately detailed trio of Gothic entries leading into the church. Now, there was an African-American congregation, the Second Christian Church, that built a new building on West 9th Street in the African-American neighborhood, Ransom Place, in 1910. And they referred to this as their bungalow church. And we haven't talked about bungalows yet, but it is much like a bungalow with a sweeping roof, natural materials, brick on the first story, and board and batten wood frame on the upper story. We're now ready to talk about residences in our period. And one of the chief styles in the 1880s was the Queen Anne style. Where did the inspiration for this come from? Well, chiefly from the work of an English architect, Richard Norman Shaw, and his colleagues. Here's one of Shaw's houses, and we can see characteristics of the Queen Anne are asymmetrical arrangement of features, a picturesque silhouette, gables coming out at different angles, different type of materials, shingles and clapboards, and then these tall brick chimney stacks. We go to Indianapolis, we immediately find an example which owes something to the English Queen Anne, namely the Fairbanks Alex House at 16th and Park, designed by John H. Stem. The chief feature that draws our attention is its brick central tower with a tall pyramidal roof. These two gables look a little bit symmetrical, but they're really different. So they're not symmetrical. And asymmetrical also is this porch, which only goes 2/3 across the facade, and then these tall brick chimney stacks. This is one of the more interesting designs in Indianapolis for our period. The Schmidt Shaft House at 14th and Delaware Street. The turret is not so unusual. It's so unusual, as we shall see in a minute. But what's unusual is this two-story veranda around the second and third stories of the turret. The architect, we think, was Adolph Scher, and Scher also designed a Romanesque arch around the entryway, and then these pointed gables with terracotta detail, which are similar to work of Richard Norman Shaw in urban situations. Now, after only 10 years, a big change. They redesigned this to take off the turret and design a completely different veranda. This is now the Indianapolis Propylaeum. Now, for Queen Anne houses in Indianapolis and wood frame variety, many of them among many north-south streets, this was the formula that developed. Namely, you can see this in the Smith Hall House and up on Alabama Street, a 3-story tower with a conical roof balanced by a front-facing gable. So that's sort of the formula, followed many houses. But if we go over to Meridian Street, we see some variations. This large mansion, the Addison Harris House, it has a turret on one side, but it does not have a balancing gable. Instead, it has a small Romanesque arch over the entryway. Here's one of more delightful, picturesque Queen Anne houses, designed by this artistic architect, Louis H. Gibson, who had published several books of his own house designs nationally. In this case, the Kreitland House on Meridian Street, he exposed the structure of this wood frame structure, used polychromy or different paint colors to bring out the elements, and then this delightful picturesque tower on the side elevation. There were a few families and institutions that wanted Italian Renaissance style houses, including the Catholic Diocese for their bishop's house at 614th and Meridian Street. They hired 2 New York architects to design this. This is very much like a 16th century Italian Renaissance palazzo with these limestone rusticated blocks, this carefully proportioned ionic porch, a pediment over a second floor window, and this projecting Italian Renaissance cornice. Now, across the street was an even more elaborate Italian Renaissance palace. This was the Colonel Eli Lilly House on Meridian Street, designed by Bernard Vonnegut. The outside was limestone. Our eyes are immediately drawn to this tower with a Palladian device. Let me define that. That is a tall central opening with a curved opening with rectangular openings on either side. There were alternating segmental and triangular pediments over the windows for the Italian Renaissance, and then also rusticated first story. Now, we've been talking about the homes of the wealthy and the middle class, but there were many working class houses being built in our period. In fact, there were more working class houses built than any other kind of house. This is the Richard Murphy House on Camp Street in the African-American neighborhood Ransom Place. This exemplifies the workers' cottage, which has been built by many years, continued to be built past the turn of the century. Its features are an L-shaped plan with a porch stuck in the right angle between the wings. Also, another building type that emerged in Ransom Place and some other places in the downtown was the shotgun house. This is John Churchill House on Camp Street. The shotgun house idea originated, as believed, in West Africa, came over the Caribbean and came up the Mississippi River. What are its characteristics? 1 room wide, only 2 rooms or 3 rooms deep, and an off-center entryway. This is the Churchill House, as I said, on Camp Street. Another house, the Ambrose Smith House, has a different kind of shotgun variation here with a veranda across the facade. Now, at the turn of the century, there was another type of architectural theme coming out for houses. This is a so-called American Forest Square. One of the larger examples is the R.W. Furnace House up on Pennsylvania Street. What are the characteristics of the American Forest Square? A rectangular oblong-shaped block with a hip roof, and then this dormer window with this individual hip roof. An example, more usual style size is the Congresswoman Julia Carson House up on Park Avenue, designed by Frank Hunter. And you can see it has a hip roof with this dormer window above, and then two bay windows. Now, another theme that was very popular in the early 20th century came over from England. That is 16th century vernacular houses in England. This is called the so-called English Tudor style. And here's an example, the Maria Fletcher Hare House, designed by Charles Byfield, and later the home of the novelist Booth Tarkington. The characteristics are stucco and timber second story, an off-center gable, and then this shed dormer with a brick first story. This has been restored by Doris Ann and Tim Sadler. Now, another theme from England was the English arts and crafts style. This was particularly embodied in the ideas of a man named William Morris, who preached the idea of handicrafts rather than machine-made furniture and houses. His ideas were particularly picked up by a man named Gustav Stickley, who published many designs on English arts and crafts in the Craftsman magazine. This example, the Wrecker House in Irvington, may have been designed by Gustav Stickley himself. The characteristics are this sweeping roof with these trio of shed dormers. The porch is hollowed out of the mass, and there's clapboard on the side. Another building type for working class people has been called the bungalow. The term came over from India to the United States. Originally, it denoted a generic type of house, a one-story house with perhaps a porch in the front, such as this house in Emerson Heights. But by 1910, it was becoming, the term bungalow was really coming to refer to California bungalows, as they were called. And the characteristics of California bungalows are these steeply projecting gables supported by brackets. And this is an example found by Paul Diebold up on College Avenue and built by the Bungalow Company. Now, there were still some families and people that wanted houses based on historical periods, such as novelist Meredith Nicholson on Delaware Street hired Folsom Parker to design this house, which is derived from early Georgian houses in New England. The characteristics are a regular series of bays or openings across the facade. In this case, we have dormer windows with pediments and a gambrel roof. Right next door to it is this very unusual looking house, the Reed Dixon House, designed by the same architects, rather unique. And they said the style of this is the, quote, the Italian style of feudal period. And we'd have to agree with these battlements with crenellations on two different levels and these medieval style tracery. Now, there were some people who wanted an updated version of Italian Renaissance for the house. An example was the couple, Cornelia Cole and Charles Fairbanks. For their house at 30th Meridian, they chose Howard Van Doren Shaw of Chicago as their architect. What are the characteristics of the updated Italian Renaissance? A hip roof, these paired Ionic pilasters, and a round-headed arch. Now, I think without any question, the largest house ever built on Meridian Street was the Frank Van Camp House on the 2800 block of Meridian Street, designed by our old acquaintance, William Price. He drew from English Tudor palace architecture of the 16th century for a number of details of this house, such as dripstones over some of the windows, crenellated battlements, and these Gothic style gables. And there were a few houses designed in the Spanish Mission style, such as the Louis Burkhoff House up in the historic Meridian Park, designed by Clarence Martindale. Characteristics, these gables with curves and reverse curves like Spanish Missions, and then these quatrefoils in the center. And our final building type are apartment buildings. This was a new building type in the United States, started in the 1880s. The earliest I was able to find is the Belmont Flats up on Delaware Street. The architect used 2 stair towers with Romanesque details, and for the comfort of the tenants, put verandas on the exterior. I think the most distinguished apartment building of the 1890s was the Bluchern Apartments in Vermont and Meridian, built by the novelist Lew Wallace and designed by John Thurtle. And one of the most delightful features of this is this Romanesque arch with this growling lion, the keystone, and these curved up serpents sculpted by Henry Saunders. Now, if you're a budget-minded tenant, you might want to live in the Bronx Apartments on Central Avenue, designed by R.P. Daggett and Company. with these simply detailed main buildings for the tenants, but with these more expansive verandas for their enjoyment. There was the Audubon Court Apartments in Irvington with a court faced by row house type apartment buildings. And finally, there was the Buckingham Apartments up in Meridian Street designed by Rubish and Hunter with a sunken garden and Renaissance style arches and Tudor palace details. Now, here are some of the sources used for my presentation tonight. And photo sources. And for those of you who would like to hear more about my forthcoming book on the first century of Indianapolis architecture, you can email me this email address. Thank you very much. Well, I thank you for your very generous approach. Okay, sure.
Well, you, ladies and gentlemen, you've just experienced a true marvel. 2 semesters of architectural history in 1 hour. Brilliant work. If you ever want to embark on a second career, Jim, you can always sell Jimmy John's sandwiches. You can talk that fast. Thank you. We promised you that this would be about an hour, and we're going to take just a couple of questions for Dr. Glass. Who would like to be the first in? There's one. Yep. I think it's worth it.
Sent the plans for the public library back from the front from the First World War.
The question from Marjorie Kenley, is it true that Paul Cray sent the plans for the Central Library back to Indianapolis from the Western Front in France, where he was a French soldier? According to the research done by Mary Ellen Gadsky, sort of a source authority on the Central Library, I believe the design was really complete. Well, excuse me. The original design sufficient to win the competition was finished before Cray was drafted in the French Army. His associate architects, I believe, provided much more details for the working drawings. I don't think he was doing any drafting in the French front. Yes, ma'am. Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of the question.
Three old arcades downtown that are still intact.
Yeah.
Why was there a demise of the Pembroke arcade?
Okay, the question was that there's 3 arcades that survived from Cleveland. Why was the Pembroke Arcade demolished? In a word, for a parking lot. 1943. No, the concept for some reason did not take here in Indianapolis. I don't know the full explanation for why it didn't take, but Dixon and Talbot lost a lot of money on it. It was converted to several other uses and finally demolished for a parking lot. Yes. The question from Dr. Tom Grice is, what was the cost of the State House? Just under $2 million, and the state was very proud of getting it done under budget. Yes.
That first house you showed, the first residence, where was that? And it's still there.
First house. First house.
What did it look like?
Oh, yes, yes. The at 16th and Park. That was the alley, the Fairbanks alley house. That was demolished about 15 years ago.
On the old city hall and also on the Sonic Temple, they look like they're keeping windows, but they're solid stone. Were those ever meant to be windows?
Okay, the question is the limestone panels that filled the wall, the windows, particularly of the Masonic Temple, I think your question is. Well, no, they're both of them. Both of them, I have the windows filled in with limestone. The case of the Masonic Temple, I don't know the explanation because historical photos show that some of those windows had stained glass in them originally. I do not know why they filled them in. In the case of City Hall, the windows were there until 1962, and it was converted to the State Museum. The State Museum decided to seal them to create, to screen out natural light in their exhibits, I think. Does that answer your question?
One more question.
Yes.
On the I see that everywhere, on the east side, west side. This one company making all of these houses, or plans like a Sears house?
Question is, these L-shaped Victorian workers' cottages I refer to, being designed or built by one company. I think, although I said L-shaped, there were variations on the plan. They weren't all L-shaped. They were also built over a long period of time. I think the original ones, 1850s and 60s, were pattern book probably. And then there were other sources in the late 19th century. Not probably very many architect design workers' cottages. Did you want to?
I think we're okay. Well, with that, I regret to say that this evening's program will come to an end, but I think you understand why Dr. Glass is so popular, and this series we hope will go on for many years to come. And we all look forward to the publication of his book on Indianapolis architecture, 1820 to 1920. Jim, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for coming tonight.